like to talk about one of the more obscure but interesting dive watches of the 60s and 70s, and that's the Aquastar Benthos 500. To start with the company, it was a Swiss brand, started in the 60s, and I believe it stayed in original ownership into the 70s, and that's really what I'm mostly interested in. Since probably the mid-70s, it's been bought and sold by different entities, and it's recently been restarted. But again, I'm mostly interested in the original years from the 60s to the 70s because I believe that's really when they had their peak productivity. And the company focused on dive watches and yacht timers, really. Their most interesting watches were their dive watches. Now, to put things in reference, in the 60s, scuba diving was becoming more and more popular. It was a relatively new technology at the time, and it was really important to be able to time your dives underwater. Now, the traditional way, as far as watches, was to have an external bezel, like this watch happens to have. There was another model that Aquastar released in '63 called the Aquastar 63, and I have a separate review about it. It's a bit hard with the dome crystal, but its main claim to fame was its internal rotating bezel that would work like this. The problem with something like this is if you have it on your wrist, it's not easy to use, and especially if you're wearing gloves or something to that effect. So internal bezels in theory are really, really great, but there are relatively few internal bezels that are really easy to use underwater, or even just when it's on your wrist. So while this was an interesting innovation, and I believe one of the first watches to ever have an internal bezel, I don't think it really quite hit the spot. So the other watch that they released at the time, probably the mid to late 60s roughly, was the Aquastar Benthos. Incidentally, they also had Deep Star, which was one of the first dive chronos with a Valjoux 72 movement. That, I think, has been the watch that was recently reissued. There's also a fascinating fiberglass Glass Star. That looks super cool, but you can't disassemble it for service without destroying it. So I guess it was meant to last. But anyway, probably the flagship watch was the Benthos 500. Now, this watch, as I said before, initially you would use an external bezel, but this watch had another way of timing, and that's the orange hand at slightly off 12 o'clock. Now, most people would look at it and they think it's a GMT hand, but it's actually not. It's a very primitive chronograph. And as you see, you have the crown at 2 o'clock, and then you have a push button at 4 o'clock. And the way this primitive dive timer works is when you press it in, you're going to reset the hand all the way, like that, and that's it. The timer has started. It is going to time 60 minutes and then stop. Now, technically you can call this a flyback, because at any point as it's rotating around the dial, if you press it again, it'll reset back to 0. So it's not a stop, start, reset function. So you can't keep track and record your timing. So it's a very primitive chronograph mechanism. So that's the principle of how this works. Conceivably, you're underwater, or you're about to go underwater. You press this down to reset the hand, and your bottom timer, as it's called, has started, and you can time up to 60 minutes. And it was a pretty innovative idea, but like I've mentioned before, the watch world has a history of innovative ideas that never really go anywhere for one reason or another. And this, I guess, in principle, was one of them, because no one's really ever done too many of these types of watches since. And again, you have to understand, at the time, this was cutting edge. This was probably bleeding edge technology. But for the most part, I think you can say the external bezel really ended up dominating technologically for timekeeping underwater. So that's a description of how it works. Now, I'll go briefly into the movement. Now, most Aquastar non-yacht timers used Adolf Schild movements. I guess you can call those sort of workhorse tractor basic movements, which are pretty ubiquitous in watches at the time. Both, like, for instance, the Aquastar 63 and Benthos use basic Adolf Schild movements. The Deep Star used the Valjoux 72, and usually the yacht timers used Lemania chronos. Even though Lemania had a chrono with a central hand, they never used it on this. So anyway, I'm going to pull up a picture of the bog standard Adolf Schild movement that this is based on. Now there are two variations. There was a 21K beat movement, and then there was a later 28K movement. It's basically the same thing aside from the beat rate. Now, on the right hand is the base movement. On the left hand is the modified movement. And if you look carefully, there were a few parts added to try to not complicate things any more than necessary. Basically, there were a handful of parts added, and you can easily tell because they were labeled here. This is not my image. Everything is labeled clearly from where it was taken, so I'm certainly not taking credit for anything like that. But basically, the parts are labeled here, and the gist of it is what happens when you depress the pusher. That pushes the lever, which pushes the rack, which basically aligns the minute counter wheel, which would be attached to the 60-minute bottom timer chrono hand, and it sort of syncs it up to the cannon pinion, which drives the minute hand. So it sort of piggybacks onto the cannon pinion, so it ends up keeping time along the minute hand mechanism. So that's why you could say it's a very primitive chronograph in that it's a chronograph, but it's not a traditional chronograph mechanism like you would see in other watches. Now, I'm assuming it was custom adapted for Aquastar because there's no evidence of this kind of mechanism being used anywhere else. If I'm wrong with that, I'm happy to be corrected. And there's no evidence of this kind of movement being used since Aquastar went under. So again, I mean, looking at it from sort of an evolutionary perspective, I'm assuming that's a sign that it probably wasn't a very good idea, all things considered. So here we have the modified movement, and that's how it works. Now, historically, and the reasons why the watch fascinates me is, number one, I think it looks cool. Now, this is a particularly, in this particular model, it's a navy-ish dial, and originally it was, the bezel was matching, except it's faded. I believe there are also black variants of this. There's not that much known about that because the company wasn't around that long in the original version, and there's not a lot of literature available as far as like figuring out what a serial number means and things like that. It's believed that there are black dial versions. There's a decompression bezel. Apparently in Australia they were co-branded as Tissot, and so there are slight variations, but the gist of it, it's the same thing. It's a unique chronograph, simple primitive chronograph that allows you to time underwater. Now, of course, that was when it was new. Now the problem in contemporary times is the watch is pretty obscure. Almost every model of the Benthos 500 you find has been beat up. This, relative terms, is in good condition. These were workhorse watches like Doxa subs of the time period. It's pretty rare to find one in really good condition. They were beaten, bashed, and this has like a 4mm thick mineral crystal, so they really were used for their intended purpose. So the problem is, while the movement itself is pretty basic, the adaptations are not. And unless someone starts making the spare parts, which to my knowledge hasn't happened, if you need anything for it, you're looking to cannibalize another one. And that was unfortunately my experience. I bought this from the estate of the original owner, and the original owner, for one reason or another, had the triangle of the bottom timer clipped off. I wasn't happy with that. So I stalked eBay for about a year and a half before I was able to find a beat-up replacement hand that was still quite pricey, had to be repainted, but was eventually put on the watch. I have another one that needs a new dial because it has paint loss, and I've been searching eBay for about 4 years and making contacts all over the world, and I've only seen one, but apparently it sold for over 400 US, which is just crazy. But it's a point I want to make is if you're into these kinds of watches, you are going to pay through the nose if you're looking for spares. So if you happen to be looking for these watches, get them in the best condition you can. As far as the chrono mechanism, it's finicky. There are not a lot of people who like working on them. In the US, there's Jack at IWW, he's who I used for this particular one. In my experience, he really doesn't like working on the movements. They're not really terribly reliable. Like, one of the big problems you have with the chrono, the simple chrono, is when you're servicing it, it won't always run 60 minutes. And apparently you have to keep disassembling it to make sure the chrono will actually run 60 minutes at a time. And this is obviously not the kind of watch you can just give any old random person to service, because it may not end well. So parts availability is a really, really big issue, and if that's something that scares you, this is a watch you definitely don't want to touch. The other reasons, aside from the aesthetics, that it means a lot to me is it's a relic, well, I guess it's a relic of a time gone by. It's a piece of history. This was when sport diving was new, and this, as I said before, was bleeding edge technology. I mean, it might as well be something that you see in a museum. It's useless nowadays. No one would use such antiquated technology for diving anymore. It's outlived its purpose, but it's still a reminder of times gone by. I'm not, I don't get terribly emotional or attached to things like that, but there's just something really cool about owning something that just once had a use and it just simply no longer has a use. Anything like a mechanical calculator, or, well, I guess mechanical watches in general in this day and age. But it's a piece of history. Aquastar was involved with a bunch of Jacques Cousteau work, and not the Benthos though. Especially I think like the Deep Star chrono, but it has a lot of really interesting history. And in the 70s, Aquastar was one of the big companies, along with Omega, that were doing really innovative dive watches at the time. Now, the company didn't really last in the 70s, and they were bought out and then bought out again, and eventually they released a Benthos 1000, which used a modified Tag Heuer Super Professional case, but interestingly enough, the same movement. And those apparently were very few of those were ever sold, and when they do appear on the market, they're almost always in like new old stock condition, which is the exact opposite of the original Benthos 500s. But even though they used the same movements, there was actually a Lemania version of the Benthos 1000 too, which didn't have a Lemania movement in it, and no one knows how that or why that happened. You would think a Lemania 5100 modification would work great on this, but it never happened. And I've done a few reviews of watches that have central chrono hands. They're very few, because it's basically a Lemania 5100 or a Dubois-Dupraz piggyback movement. So in the long run, for dive watch purposes, the central chrono hand never really worked out. But again, I guess the reality is, if nothing else, the watch looks pretty cool, and that's why I like it. It's, to be frank, a pain in the ass when you're dealing with watches like this as far as parts and service and stuff like that. But it's a really unique watch. You're never going to see anything like this again. I mean, sure, maybe the new company will make some reissue of it or anything, but it's not going to be a tool watch like the original was. And you can tell it's really high quality. It's really high quality. It has a high quality case back, and just a lot of detail that tells you, for the time period, this was not some cheap run-of-the-mill watch. The hands, I guess, the aesthetic of the hands could be a little bit better, especially with a nice bottom timer hand, but it is what it is as far as that goes. It's heavy, it's chunky, it's a cushion case, which is pretty standard for the time period, and again, if you put it by something like a Doxa 300 sub of the same time period, they generally have the same aesthetic, the same heft, and things like that. So that's really the overall picture. It's sort of one other thing I guess I want to mention is, in all this talk about in-house movements, unique movements, this is an example of, in essence, I guess, sort of an in-house movement, because there was some speculation that Lemania actually did the assembly. I'm sorry, Adolf Schild actually did the assembly, or actually could have been Lemania. There's that little information available on it. But regardless, it was a unique complication made for just this company, and obviously it used a basic, sort of simplistic, cheapish movement, and it created a unique complication that you really haven't seen, to my knowledge, before or since. And again, there's probably a good reason for that, but nonetheless, it's unique. It looks unique, it functions uniquely, and in my book, that really makes it really interesting. And once it's serviced, you could wear it on a regular basis. I think you'd be crazy to try to dive with it or anything, but it's perfectly usable every day. And so long as you're okay. Again, in general, if you start getting into collecting old watches, the further back in time you go, especially with the more obscure companies, parts availability is just going to be something you have to accept, namely cannibalization. Maybe down the road there'll be 3D printing or something, but for this purpose, it's not easy to source parts. But I still think it's a worthwhile sacrifice to get something so unique looking. And I don't know, perhaps the new company will end up doing a reissue of this. Again, as I said, there are not many alternatives for a mechanical central chrono hand unless you do quartz, and then even then I think there's only like one ETA quartz movement that would allow for a central hand. But it really was interesting for the time, and it's fun to wear. Pain in the ass with everything else, but again, I think it's a worthwhile trade-off. And that's about it for this video, and as usual, thanks for watching.